Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eduyot. We are up to Perek Gimel, Mishna Yudbet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. להבדיל בין חיים לחיים ודרפואה שלמה דניאל שלום בן רוזה בתוך שאר חולי ישראל ודחלמה מהרה of בנימין אור ציון חי בן דבורה. This Mishnah, which also appears in Betzat chapter 2 Mishnah 8, lists three lenient rulings of another Tana that were disputed by the sages. שלושה דברים רבי אלעזר בן עזריה מתיר והחכמים אוסרים. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah permits these three things, but the sages prohibit them. Parato yotz'a birtsu'a sheben karnea. His cow would go out on Shabbat into a public domain with a decorative ribbon between its horns, because in his view, a decorative ribbon is an item of clothing for a cow, and so the cow's wearing of the ribbon is not an act of carrying. In general, a Jew may not let his animal do any of the 39 melachot on Shabbat. One of these melachot is hosa'ah, transferring, meaning moving an item from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa, or 4 amot in a public domain. It is therefore forbidden to go into a public domain with something on one's body, unless it is an item of clothing. Nevertheless, Rabbi Elazar allowed a cow to be led out into a public domain wearing a decorative ribbon, because he regards such a ribbon as a decorative item of clothing for a cow. Although the Mishnah calls it his cow, it did not belong to Rabbi Elazar but to his neighbor. Since he did not stop his neighbor from letting it out on Shabbat, he shares responsibility for the act, and the cow is therefore described as belonging to him. Umkardin et habema b'yom tov, and he rules that we may curry, we may scratch and scrape the body of an animal with the fine-toothed metal comb on Yom Tov, even though the sharp teeth of the comb might prick the animal and make it bleed, which is prohibited under the melacha of slaughtering, because this result is not intended. This is a case of davar she'eino mitkaven, something that is unintended, which is the term for an action that might result in a melacha taking place, but the person performing it did not intend for that result to happen. In our Mishnah's example, the person currying the animal might make it bleed, which is a melacha, but he did not intend for this to happen. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon disagree whether such an action is permitted or forbidden in Betzah, page 23b. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah sides with Rabbi Shimon, who deems it permitted. V'shochakin et apilpilin barechaim shelahen, and he rules that we may grind peppercorns in the small grinders that are made specifically for grinding them. The sages, however, disagree with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. In their view, a cow may not be let out with a decorative ribbon between its horns, because they hold that it is not an item of clothing. They prohibit currying an animal with a fine tooth metal comb, because that might make the animal bleed. The sages hold that one is forbidden to perform any action that might result in melacha, even if one did not intend for the melacha to take place. And they prohibit grinding peppercorns in a regular pepper grinder, because doing so seems like a weekday activity. According to the sages, someone who needs to grind peppercorns and Yom Tov may not do so in the usual weekday manner. Therefore, instead of using the regular grinder, he must crush the peppercorns with a pestle, a heavy blunt tool, in a mortar bowl. As the Rash writes in Betzah, page 14a. Because again, according to the sages, someone who needs to grind peppercorns in Yom Tov may not do so in the usual weekday manner. Now, the Mishnah elaborates upon currying an animal on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says, "En mikardin et behema b'Yom Tov mipnei shu oseh chabura." We may not curry an animal with a fine-toothed metal comb on Yom Tov, because it might make a bleeding wound in the animal. Aval mikartzefin, but we may curry with a blunt-toothed wooden comb, because it will not make such a wound. V'chachamim omrim, however, the sages say, and mikardin aflo mikartzefin, we may not curry with a metal comb or with a wooden comb, because if a wooden comb would be allowed, people might think that all combs are allowed, even metal ones. Rabbi Yehuda and the sages agree that an action that might unintentionally result in a melacha is forbidden. Therefore, both prohibit currying with a metal comb, since bleeding might result. The sages extend this prohibition to include a wooden comb in order to make sure that people will not come to use a metal one. And that is the end of Perek Gimel Mishnah Yudbet. The Rav does tell us the halacha. The halacha does not follow Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, except in the case of scraping, currying the body of an animal with a fine-tooth metal comb on Yom Tov, and that the halacha does follow him, because we hold like Rabbi Shimon that davar sheno mitkaven mutar, that an action that might result in melacha taking place, but the person performing it did not intend for that result to happen, is allowed. We continue with Perek Daled Mishnah Aleph. In most disputes between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai take the stricter position and Bet Hillel take the more lenient position. The next two chapters cite cases where the opposite is true. Elu dvarim mikule Bet Shammai umichumre Bet Hillel. These disputes listed in this chapter are ones in which the more lenient rulings are from Bet Shammai and the stricter rulings are from Bet Hillel. The disputes recorded in this Mishnah also recorded in Betzah, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. The first one concerns an egg that was laid on Yom Tov. Betzah shenolda b'Yom Tov, if an egg was laid on a Yom Tov that fell on Sunday, Bet Shammai omrim te'achel. Bet Shammai say that it may be eaten that day, even though the egg became complete and fully developed the day before on Shabbat. Bet Hillel omrim lo te'achel, but Bet Hillel say that it may not be eaten that day because it was prepared for Yom Tov on Shabbat. Bet Hillel learned from a verse that there is a law of hachana, preparation, which requires that food used on Yom Tov or Shabbat be prepared for the holy day on an ordinary weekday and not on a Shabbat or Yom Tov. This is in Betzah, page 2b. Therefore, if an item of food was prepared on Shabbat for a Yom Tov that occurs the following day, which would be Sunday, that item lacks the preparation needed to make it usable that Yom Tov day. It is therefore prohibited on that Yom Tov. This hachana requirement is relevant in the case of an egg, because an egg becomes fully developed, prepared within a hen one day before it is laid. Therefore, if an egg is laid on a Yom Tov that falls on Sunday, the egg became fully developed or prepared the day before on Shabbat, and not on an ordinary weekday. Bet Hillel ruled that the egg is forbidden because it lacks proper hachana, even though this preparation did not involve any melacha, any biblically prohibited activity, and it happened on its own. Nevertheless, since it did not take place on the ordinary weekday, the egg may not be eaten on that Yom Tov. Moreover, Bet Hillel hold that an egg is forbidden, not only if it is laid on a Yom Tov that falls on Sunday, but even if it is laid on a Yom Tov that falls on any other weekday, even though there is no problem of hachana. The sages were concerned that if an egg were to be permitted on Yom Tov that falls on any other weekday, people would mistakenly permit an egg that was laid on Sunday as well. They therefore prohibited it on every Yom Tov, no matter on what day of the week it falls. Nevertheless, the Mishnah speaks of the main case of this law, which is an egg laid on Sunday. Bet Shammai, on the other hand, do not learn a hachana requirement from the verse and therefore permit an egg that is laid in Yom Tov, as Tosfot writes in Eruvin, page 38a. The next dispute concerns the Yom Tov of Pesach. On this Yom Tov, a person is biblically forbidden to eat or even to own chametz, dough that has risen, or sourdough, dough that is fermented to the point that it can cause other dough to rise. The Torah states in Shemot, chapter 13, verse 7, V'lo yireh lecha chametz, v'lo yireh lecha sa'o b'chol gevulecha. Chametz shall not be seen, and sourdough shall not be seen in all your borders. This verse prohibits owning chametz and sourdough on Pesach. Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagree about the minimum amount of these substances a person is forbidden to own on Pesach. Bet Shammai omrim, Bet Shammai say, sa'o b'chazait. The smallest amount of sourdough that the Torah prohibits a person to own on Pesach is an olive's volume, the chametz b'kakotevet, and the smallest amount of chametz that the Torah prohibits a person to own on Pesach is a date's volume, which is larger than an olive's volume. Bet Shammai reason that if the prohibited amounts of sourdough and chametz were the same, the Torah would have said chametz shall not be seen in all your borders without adding sourdough. There is no need to mention sourdough because it is simply a stronger form of chametz. Why then the Torah mentioned sourdough? To teach that the amount of sourdough one may not own is different from the amount of chametz one may not own. Therefore, since sourdough is stronger than regular chametz, it is prohibited in a smaller amount of an olive's volume, whereas regular chametz is prohibited in the larger amount of a date's volume. Bet Hillel omrim, but Bet Hillel say zeh v'zeh b'kazait. This and that, the smallest amounts of sourdough and chametz that the Torah prohibits a person to own on Pesach are both in olive's volume. Bet Hillel hold that the smallest amount of chametz and sourdough the Torah prohibits is derived from the smallest amount of chametz and sourdough one may not eat, which everyone agrees is an olive's volume. Rabbinically, however, it is forbidden to keep even less than an olive's volume. And that is an Abu Taib today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.